Rip that boarding pass. She isn't flying today. Nicole Bennett's voice sliced through gate C-18 so sharply that conversations stopped mid-sentence and dozens of travelers instinctively turned toward the boarding lane. The airport had been humming with the familiar rhythm of rolling carry-on bags, boarding announcements, and coffee cups clinking against cafe tables only seconds before. But now the entire gate felt frozen beneath a silence that carried far more weight than the loud command itself. Standing calmly in front of the boarding scanner was Naomi Brooks, dressed in a plain black t-shirt, dark blue jeans, and spotless white sneakers, holding nothing more than a small leather backpack and a folded boarding pass. She looked like someone heading home after a long business trip, not someone expecting special treatment. Nicole barely glanced at the boarding pass before curling her lip into a dismissive smile. Business elite boarding isn't for people who wander into the wrong line, she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, while others simply exchanged uncomfortable looks. Naomi didn't flinch. Her expression remained composed, her breathing steady, her eyes focused only on the woman standing between her and the aircraft. My boarding pass was scanned correctly when I checked in, Naomi replied in a calm, measured voice. Would you mind scanning it again? Nicole laughed softly and looked over her shoulder toward Ryan Cooper, another flight attendant standing nearby with a tablet in his hands. You seeing this? She asked. Another person who thinks confidence can upgrade a ticket. Ryan smirked before shrugging. Ma'am, first and business cabins aren't self-service. If your seat belonged up there, you'd already be on the plane. Several passengers shifted awkwardly. A middle-aged woman carrying a laptop bag frowned. A young father quietly pulled his daughter a step closer. Others pretended not to notice, staring into their phones while listening to every word. Naomi extended the boarding pass once more without raising her voice. Please scan it. Nicole stared at the paper for a long second before taking it between two fingers as though it were something she didn't want to touch. Then, with one quick motion that drew a collective gasp from the gate, she tore the boarding pass cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed louder than anyone expected. Half of the pass fluttered onto the polished terminal floor. The other remained in Nicole's hand as she smiled with quiet satisfaction. Problem solved, she said. You're not boarding this aircraft today. The overhead announcement continued calling final passengers for Flight 728 to Seattle, but nobody moved. Every pair of eyes stayed locked on the unfolding confrontation. Naomi slowly looked down at the torn pieces resting near her sneakers before lifting her gaze back toward Nicole. There was no anger on her face, no panic, no pleading. Only a calm that somehow made the growing tension feel even heavier. You're making a very expensive mistake, she said. Nicole folded her arms. No, I'm protecting my airline. Naomi held her gaze for another silent moment while the boarding bridge remained open behind them, waiting for passengers who suddenly seemed far more interested in what was happening at the gate than reaching their seats. Somewhere near the back of the waiting area, someone quietly whispered, "She doesn't look upset at all." Another voice answered just as softly, "Maybe she knows something they don't." Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she was, neither stepping forward nor retreating, while the torn boarding pass rested on the polished floor between her shoes. The silence around gate C-18 grew heavier with every passing second because her composure did not match the confrontation unfolding around her. Most people who found themselves publicly embarrassed would have argued, demanded a supervisor, or walked away in frustration. Naomi did none of those things. She simply observed. She watched the boarding bridge, the agents scanning passengers, the crew exchanging confident smiles, and the travelers quietly pretending not to stare. She had chosen to travel exactly this way for a reason. There was no tailored business suit, no luxury handbag, no recognizable jewelry, and no executive assistant walking beside her. Everything about her appearance had been intentionally ordinary. She wanted every employee she encountered to make a decision based only on character instead of assumptions. Months earlier, reports had begun arriving on her desk describing travelers who believed they had been treated differently because of how they looked rather than what their tickets showed. Some complaints involved expensive cabins. Others involved boarding lines, customer service counters, or airport lounges. Each investigation had ended with the same explanation: miscommunication, human error, policy enforcement. The words appeared neat on paper, but Naomi had spent decades building organizations and knew that patterns rarely appeared by accident. That was why she had booked this flight under her legal name without requesting any executive notification. Only one person outside the board of directors knew exactly where she would be that morning, and even that person had received instructions not to interfere unless absolutely necessary. Naomi believed that policies revealed themselves most honestly when nobody realized leadership was watching. Across the gate, Ryan folded his arms with growing confidence as more business elite passengers continued boarding. Nicole accepted cheerful greetings from several travelers, smiling warmly before returning her attention to Naomi with a colder expression. The contrast was impossible to miss. A businessman wearing an expensive navy blazer walked directly past without showing identification after offering only his last name. Nicole welcomed him aboard with an enthusiastic smile. Moments later, an elderly couple dressed for vacation received patient assistance with their luggage. Naomi quietly noticed every interaction, saying nothing while committing each detail to memory. Near the seating area, a young woman carrying a backpack lowered her phone after pretending to read a message. She had witnessed the entire exchange and now looked increasingly uncomfortable. A father traveling with 2 children leaned toward another passenger and whispered that something about the situation did not feel right. Even those who remained silent had begun paying closer attention. The atmosphere had changed. It was no longer simply another boarding process. It had become an unspoken test of fairness, unfolding in plain sight before dozens of strangers who had expected nothing more dramatic than an on-time departure. Naomi slowly checked the time on her watch before looking back toward the aircraft door. 9 minutes, she thought quietly. Sometimes the truth needed only a few moments and the right audience to reveal itself. The final boarding announcement echoed through the terminal as another small group of passengers crossed the scanner and disappeared down the jet bridge. Yet Naomi Brooks remained standing exactly where she had been, her calm presence becoming impossible to ignore. Nicole Bennett checked the boarding clock with visible impatience before folding her arms again. "You are delaying this flight," she declared. "If you do not leave this boarding lane voluntarily, airport security will escort you away." Naomi met her eyes without the slightest change in expression. "I have not blocked a single passenger," she answered quietly. "I simply asked that my valid boarding pass be scanned." Ryan Cooper shook his head with an exaggerated sigh. "That boarding pass does not exist anymore," he replied, glancing toward the torn pieces still lying on the polished floor. "Maybe next time you should purchase the correct ticket instead of pretending you belong in business elite." The remark drew uncomfortable silence rather than laughter. Several passengers exchanged uneasy looks. A man wearing a gray sport coat slowly lowered the newspaper he had been reading. Across the seating area, a college student removed one earbud, sensing that the situation had become more serious than a routine boarding delay. Just beyond the gate counter, a young flight attendant named Sophia Lewis stepped out from the boarding bridge carrying a passenger manifest on her tablet. She hesitated after noticing the crowd gathered around the counter. "Nicole," she said carefully, "I think we should verify the passenger record one more time." Nicole answered without even looking at her. "There is nothing to verify." Sophia remained still. "I thought I recognized the name earlier during pre-boarding." Ryan interrupted before she could continue. "You are still in training," he said with a dismissive smile. "Let experienced crew members handle situations like this." Sophia lowered her tablet, but did not walk away. Something about Naomi's quiet confidence continued to trouble her. She had watched countless passengers become angry over missed upgrades, delayed flights, and lost luggage. None of them had responded with this level of composure after being publicly embarrassed. Near the charging stations, Emily Carter quietly raised her phone, not pointing it directly at anyone, but recording the scene from her seat. Beside her, Marcus Reed, a software executive traveling to Seattle, leaned forward and spoke just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "There is no reason not to scan the reservation again," he said. "If the system clears her, everyone boards. If it does not, then everyone has their answer." Nicole forced a polite smile toward him that disappeared almost instantly. "Sir, this is an employee matter. Please remain seated." Marcus nodded once, but did not look convinced. The tension spread across the gate like an approaching storm. Even passengers who had already entered the jet bridge slowed their pace. glancing back through the open doorway. Naomi looked briefly at the departure screen above the counter and then back at the employees standing before her. Her voice remained steady and almost conversational. "Every decision you make from this point forward will matter." Ryan laughed under his breath. "You keep talking like someone important is watching." Naomi allowed a faint, unreadable smile to appear for the first time that morning. "Someone is," she replied, as the seconds continued slipping quietly toward the 9th minute. The crowd at gate C18 had quietly divided without anyone announcing it. Some passengers stood with folded arms, convinced the airline employees knew something the rest of them did not. Others could no longer ignore what they had witnessed from the very beginning. Emily Carter lowered her phone for a moment and looked toward the elderly couple seated beside her. "Did either of you see her raise her voice?" she asked. The older man slowly shook his head. "Not once," he answered. "She only asked them to scan the ticket again." His wife frowned as she watched the exchange near the boarding lane. "Then why are they treating her like this?" Across the waiting area, Marcus Reed stood and walked a few steps closer to the counter. His tone remained respectful, but there was unmistakable concern in his voice. "If there has been a mistake, everyone benefits from correcting it now. Delaying the flight will only create a larger problem." Nicole Bennett responded with a practiced smile that carried none of the warmth she had offered earlier to other travelers. "Sir, our crew has already handled the situation. Please return to your seat." Marcus did not argue. He simply looked at Naomi Brooks for a brief moment before quietly stepping aside. Something about her composure suggested that she was waiting rather than hoping. Behind the counter, Sophia Lewis continued scrolling through the passenger manifest on her tablet. She hesitated after finding an entry that immediately caught her attention. The reservation attached to Naomi's legal name contained authorization codes she had only seen during corporate training. She looked up toward Nicole. "I really think we should verify this with operations," Sophia said carefully. Ryan Cooper answered before Nicole could speak. "You are reading too much into a routine boarding issue." Sophia looked back at the screen. "It is not routine. This reservation has executive clearance indicators." Nicole's expression hardened. "Close the tablet," she said firmly. "We are not discussing internal systems in front of passengers." Sophia obeyed, but uncertainty remained written across her face. Emily noticed the brief exchange and quietly resumed recording. Several travelers nearby leaned closer, trying to hear what had just been said. The mood inside the gate had shifted again. It no longer felt like one passenger disagreeing with airline staff. It felt as though the truth was trying to force its way into the open, while everyone present decided which version of the story they believed. Naomi glanced toward the large windows overlooking the runway where the aircraft waited beneath the morning sun. The engines remained silent, the boarding bridge still attached, and the departure clock continued counting forward 1 minute at a time. She slowly checked the time once more before returning her attention to the crew. "There is still an opportunity to correct this," she said calmly. Nicole answered with complete confidence. "There is nothing to correct." Naomi gave a slight nod, as though confirming something only she understood. Around the gate, conversations faded again into silence. Even passengers who had intended to stay uninvolved now found themselves watching every decision unfold. Without raising her voice or taking another step, Naomi quietly observed the people around her. She noticed who defended fairness, who remained uncertain, and who chose to ignore what was happening. In that moment, the gate had become more than a departure point. It had become a measure of character, and the final minutes before boarding closed were revealing far more than anyone had expected. The boarding clock continued its steady countdown, while the atmosphere at gate C18 grew heavier with every passing second. No one seemed interested in their phones anymore. Conversations had faded into scattered whispers, and even the families with restless children had become unusually quiet. Then a uniformed airport security officer approached the gate after receiving a brief call from Nicole Bennett. Officer Linda Hayes walked with calm professionalism, stopping several feet from Naomi Brooks before speaking in an even voice. "Good morning, ma'am. I understand there is a boarding dispute. I would like to understand what happened." Before Naomi could answer, Nicole stepped in confidently. She attempted to board without valid authorization, refused to leave the boarding lane, and has delayed our departure. Linda nodded politely and turned toward Naomi. "Is that accurate?" Naomi looked directly at her. "No, I presented a valid boarding pass. I asked for it to be scanned a second time. Instead, it was torn apart before anyone verified my reservation. Linda glanced briefly at the pieces of paper still, resting on the polished floor. She did not immediately respond. Behind her, Ryan Cooper folded his arms as though the matter had already been settled. She is leaving out the important part, he said. She insists she belongs in business elite. Naomi answered without raising her voice. I do belong there. Ryan smiled dismissively. According to you. Linda remained composed, but uncertainty had begun to replace confidence. Before she could continue, Sophia Lewis quietly stepped forward from behind the counter. Officer, she said carefully, I believe there may be information in the reservation system that has not been reviewed. Nicole immediately interrupted. Sophia, that is enough. The younger flight attendant hesitated only for a moment. I only want the reservation verified before someone makes a mistake that cannot be undone. Nicole's expression hardened, but she said nothing further. Naomi watched the exchange with the same quiet patience she had shown since arriving at the gate. Watching Sophia struggle to speak reminded her of another airport more than 20 years earlier. She had been 24 years old then, wearing a neatly pressed blouse and carrying a single briefcase after closing her first successful business contract. She remembered standing alone at another boarding gate, while an employee repeatedly questioned whether she belonged in the premium cabin despite the ticket in her hand. Other passengers had walked past without difficulty while she answered the same questions again and again. No apology ever came after the misunderstanding was finally corrected. She boarded that flight carrying something heavier than luggage. She carried the realization that respect too often depended on appearance instead of truth. That quiet moment had stayed with her through every promotion, every investment, every acquisition, and every difficult decision that eventually built one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country. She had promised herself that if she ever had the authority to shape an airline, every passenger would be treated with dignity before assumptions. Standing at gate C-18 all those years later, she realized that promise was being tested in the very company she had spent years building. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Naomi returned her attention to the present and looked calmly at Officer Linda Hayes. I am not asking for special treatment, she said. I am asking for equal treatment. Those words settled over the gate with surprising force. Several passengers quietly nodded. Even Linda seemed to pause before responding. The countdown continued. The aircraft still waited at the end of the jet bridge, and everyone standing nearby sensed that the next decision would change far more than the departure time of a single flight. Officer Linda Hayes remained silent for several long seconds after Naomi finished speaking. The entire gate seemed to wait with her. The departure monitor continued flashing the scheduled boarding status, yet no one appeared eager to move. Nicole Bennett finally broke the silence with a confident smile. Officer, we have already spent enough time on this. She no longer has a valid boarding pass, and our crew has made its decision. Linda glanced once more toward the torn paper on the floor before looking back at Naomi. Is there anyone who can verify your reservation? She asked. Naomi reached into the pocket of her jeans and calmly removed her phone. She did not rush. She did not sigh. She simply unlocked the screen and selected a single contact that had remained pinned at the top of her list for years. The call connected almost instantly. Rachel, Naomi said in the same steady voice she had used from the beginning. Please activate Protocol 7. There was no hesitation on the other end. Understood, Ms. Brooks, Rachel replied. Protocol 7 is now active. Corporate operations, human resources, legal, and executive security have been notified. Estimated arrival, 6 minutes. Naomi ended the call without another word and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Nicole exchanged an amused glance with Ryan Cooper. That was supposed to impress us? Ryan asked with a quiet laugh. Everyone claims to know someone important when they miss a flight. Naomi simply looked at the departure clock mounted above the gate. No, she answered. That call was not for you. It was for the people responsible for protecting this company. Sophia Lewis felt a chill despite the climate-controlled terminal. She had never heard the phrase Protocol 7 during ordinary crew training. It sounded less like customer service and more like something reserved for extraordinary circumstances. She quietly reopened the passenger manifest and searched Naomi's reservation once more. This time, she noticed an encrypted notation attached to the record that immediately disappeared before she could read it completely. Her eyes widened. She looked toward Nicole again. "Something just changed in the system," she whispered. Nicole frowned. "Close the tablet." "I think someone from corporate is accessing the reservation in real time," Sophia replied. Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You are making yourself nervous over nothing." Across the waiting area, Emily Carter lowered her phone just enough to speak to Marcus Reed. "Did you hear what the woman on the call said?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I did. That did not sound like someone calling a friend for help. That sounded like someone initiating a procedure." More passengers began checking the time. The quiet confidence Naomi had displayed from the beginning no longer seemed mysterious. It felt deliberate. Even Officer Linda noticed the subtle change in the atmosphere. She had responded to countless airport disputes over the years, but this one no longer resembled an ordinary disagreement between staff and a traveler. Naomi had not threatened anyone. She had not demanded special treatment. She had simply made one phone call, and somehow the mood at the gate shifted as though an invisible countdown had begun. Naomi folded her hands in front of her and calmly looked toward the windows overlooking the aircraft. "There are 5 minutes left," she said softly. "I sincerely hope everyone uses them wisely." No one answered. For the first time that morning, even Nicole Bennett's confident expression began to fade as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the far end of the terminal. The approaching footsteps grew louder until 3 sharply dressed executives appeared from the far end of the concourse, walking with quiet purpose instead of urgency. Their presence alone changed the atmosphere around Gate C-18. Airport employees standing at neighboring gates instinctively stepped aside, recognizing the senior leadership badges clipped to their jackets. At the front was Rachel Morgan, Executive Vice President of Corporate Operations, followed by General Counsel David Ellis and Chief Human Resources Officer Karen Whitfield. None of them looked toward the boarding screen. None of them asked what flight was departing. Their attention settled immediately on Naomi Brooks. Rachel stopped a few feet away and offered a respectful nod. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks," she said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We arrived as quickly as possible." The words landed with stunning force. Nicole Bennett's confident posture faltered. Ryan Cooper looked from Rachel to Naomi and back again, as though trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Officer Linda Hayes quietly stepped aside without being asked. Sophia Lewis stared at the executives, then down at her tablet, where the reservation screen had suddenly refreshed. This time the record displayed a full executive authorization banner, and beneath it was a title she had only seen during orientation videos. Her breathing caught for a moment. Emily Carter slowly lowered her phone, whispering, "I knew something was different." Marcus Reed folded his arms, saying nothing as the truth unfolded exactly as he had begun to suspect. Rachel turned toward the assembled crew with calm professionalism. "Before we continue, I would like to understand what occurred." Nicole found her voice first. This passenger presented what appeared to be an invalid boarding pass and refused to follow crew instructions. Rachel glanced toward the torn pieces still lying on the polished floor. Who destroyed the boarding pass? The silence that followed felt heavier than any answer. Ryan looked toward Nicole. Nicole looked toward the floor. Finally, she spoke quietly. "I did." Rachel nodded once without changing her expression. "Was the reservation verified before that decision was made?" Again there was silence. Sophia took one careful step forward. "No," she answered truthfully. "I requested that we verify it, but the request was declined." Rachel acknowledged her with a slight nod before facing Naomi once more. "Ms. Brooks, would you like to address the situation?" Naomi looked around the gate, meeting the eyes of passengers, crew members, and airport employees alike before speaking in the same measured tone she had maintained from the beginning. "No one here knew who I was this morning," she said. "That was intentional. Titles disappear. Uniforms change. Expensive clothing comes and goes. Character is what remains when none of those things are visible." Her gaze settled briefly on Nicole. "You denied boarding to a passenger without confirming the facts. You judged appearance before evidence. That decision would have been unacceptable no matter whose name appeared on the reservation." No one interrupted her. Even the usual airport announcements seemed distant now. Naomi finished with one final sentence that carried across the silent gate without the need for raised volume. "Respect should never depend on whether someone has the power to correct your mistake." It should be the starting point for every passenger who walks through this airport. No one present could mistake the significance of what had just been revealed, and the quiet confidence Naomi had displayed from the first moment suddenly made perfect sense to everyone watching. No one at Gate C-18 seemed to breathe as Rachel Morgan turned toward David Ellis and Karen Whitfield with a single nod. Neither executive displayed anger. Their professionalism made the moment feel even more significant. David opened a secure tablet and quietly reviewed the activity log attached to the boarding process. Karen compared the digital records with the statements that had just been given by every employee present. The information appeared quickly, time-stamped to the second. Rachel finally spoke. The reservation was valid from the moment Ms. Brooks checked in this morning. The system shows no ticketing issue, no payment issue, and no boarding restriction. It also confirms that a manual verification request was available but was never completed. Nicole Bennett's shoulders lowered as the reality settled over her. Ryan Cooper looked toward the floor without saying a word. Sophia Lewis remained perfectly still, relieved that she had trusted her instincts even though she had not possessed the authority to change the outcome herself. Officer Linda Hayes quietly stepped back, recognizing that the situation had become an internal corporate matter rather than an airport security issue. Karen addressed the crew with measured calm. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your flight duties pending a formal review under company policy. Your employee credentials will be temporarily suspended while the investigation is completed. Almost at the same moment, each crew member's company device displayed the same notification. Their digital access had been disabled. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, only the quiet efficiency of an organization enforcing its own standards. The passengers watched in complete silence. Emily Carter slowly lowered her phone, no longer interested in capturing a dramatic confrontation. Instead, she was witnessing accountability carried out with dignity. Marcus Reed nodded once to himself. That is how leadership should work, he said quietly. Nearby travelers murmured in agreement. Several employees from neighboring gates looked on with expressions that mixed surprise and reflection. Naomi Brooks bent down, picked up the two torn pieces of her boarding pass, and held them together for a brief moment before handing them to Rachel. Please include these with the incident report, she said. Not because they matter as paper, but because they remind us how quickly assumptions can become decisions. Rachel accepted them carefully. They will be included. Naomi then turned toward Sophia. Thank you for speaking when it would have been easier to remain silent. Sophia looked genuinely humbled. I only wanted the reservation checked. Naomi smiled warmly. That is exactly where fairness begins. Karen informed the waiting passengers that another qualified flight crew had already been dispatched and that boarding would resume shortly after a brief operational review. Instead of frustration, the announcement was met with understanding. Many travelers had witnessed enough to recognize that a short delay was a small price to pay for correcting something far more important than a departure schedule. The tension that had dominated the gate only minutes earlier slowly gave way to thoughtful silence. Employees standing nearby seemed to carry themselves differently, as though they understood that every interaction with a passenger reflected not only personal judgment, but the values of the entire airline. Without celebrating, without seeking applause, Naomi simply stood among the travelers like any other customer waiting for her flight, allowing the lesson to speak louder than any victory ever could. Less than 20 minutes after the first confrontation, the atmosphere at Gate C-18 had transformed completely. The replacement flight crew arrived with quiet professionalism, greeting waiting passengers with courtesy and patience before beginning a fresh boarding process. There was no rush, no confusion, and no attempt to erase what had happened only moments earlier. Instead, the airline chose transparency. Rachel Morgan personally informed the passengers that the company was reviewing the incident to ensure that every traveler would be treated with fairness and respect in the future. The announcement was brief, sincere, and free of excuses. As boarding resumed, several passengers paused beside Naomi Brooks. Emily Carter offered a grateful smile. Thank you for staying calm, she said. If you had walked away, none of us would have understood what was really happening. Marcus Reed extended his hand. You reminded everyone here that leadership is not about power. It is about responsibility. Naomi accepted the gesture with quiet appreciation. Every person who spoke up helped today, she replied. Real change never belongs to one individual. Sophia Lewis approached next, still wearing the same uniform, but carrying herself with new confidence. I almost stayed silent, she admitted. I kept telling myself someone else would say something. Naomi smiled warmly. The hardest voice to find is usually the first one. Once it speaks, others discover their own. Those words stayed with Sophia long after the conversation ended. As passengers continued boarding, airport employees at nearby gates quietly returned to their work, but many carried thoughtful expressions. They had witnessed more than a customer service dispute. They had watched assumptions collapse under the weight of simple facts. Before stepping onto the jet bridge, Naomi paused beside the large terminal windows overlooking the aircraft. Morning sunlight reflected across the polished floor, making the entire concourse feel brighter than it had when she first arrived. Rachel joined her for a final moment. The board will want a complete report, she said. Naomi nodded. Include every detail. The goal is not punishment. The goal is improvement. Rachel understood immediately. The investigation would focus not only on individual decisions, but also on training, accountability, and the culture that allowed those decisions to happen. Naomi then walked toward the aircraft without ceremony. She did not request applause, recognition, or special treatment. She simply took her assigned seat like every other passenger on board. As the cabin door closed and the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate, many travelers found themselves thinking less about the delay and more about the lesson they would remember long after reaching their destination. Respect could never depend on appearance. Kindness should never require confirmation of someone's title. A uniform could represent professionalism, but it could never replace character. Looking out the window as the runway stretched ahead, Naomi reflected on the promise she had made to herself decades earlier after experiencing unfair treatment as a young professional. That promise had never been about proving who she was. It had always been about building places where no one else would need to prove their worth before receiving basic dignity. As the aircraft lifted into the clear morning sky, one quiet truth remained behind at gate C-18, stronger than any announcement that had echoed through the terminal that day. People should never have to reveal their power before they are treated with respect. Respect should be the first thing offered, because it is the one thing that every person deserves before a single word is spoken.